I spent a lot of time in the British Museum in London, and I was told when I first tried to apply there, I was told that it was easier to get into Buckingham Palace than into the British Museum. I had to have a number of people to write me all kinds of letters to say I was right and proper person. I had to tell them what I was researching into, and so on and so forth. It was Caribbean history and Caribbean culture, or Caribbean cultural anthropology. Eventually I got in there and I spent a lot of time there. When one sat in the reading room of the British Museum, you know, it was so impressive, as though information was seeping into you. In the reading room alone, there were 7 miles of shelves. And I met a number of people there, and I began to read. I came upon a Brazilian fellow, Gilberto Freire. He was one of our finest authorities, along with Herskowitz, the two Herskowitz, husband and wife. He was one of the finest authorities on the black people in the Western Hemisphere. And he said that, in one of his books, he said, the Africans who survived the Middle Passage and who arrived in the New World were no longer Africans. They were West Indian blacks who were slaves, an entirely new and altogether different category of beings, both historically and socially. No, so I decided I must examine what this man has said there about these people are no longer Africans. What had happened to them? And I remembered that the original people in the Caribbean were Caribs, Arawaks, Simones, and the other subgroups, Amerindians. Columbus arrived there in 1492. Within 10 years, they had exterminated all these people, and they decided to import these blacks from Africa. So if they were no longer Africans, something had happened between the journey from Africa to the Caribbean. So I decided to investigate what I chose to call the de-Africanization of the African, this transformation of these people into this new being, the West Indians. Now, when we look at the development of mankind in other parts of the world, we discover that the people have evolved from a certain prehistoric or primitive stage to wherever and whatever they are today. But not so the West Indians, or the people they call the West Indians. They were transported straight from Africa and plugged straight into a modern industrial society, the sugar plantations of the West Indies. Now, I said in my book there, Renaissance Europe flourished, and so did the various kingdoms in Africa. 2 centuries later, we discovered that while in Europe, Raphael and Michelangelo were painting their finest works, Shakespeare, Racine, and Molière were producing some of their finest and accomplished pieces of writing. John Milton and his contemporaries sang. At that comparable stage of development in Africa, mankind there was suddenly and brutally arrested in their evolutionary development, and Africa's people were turned into merchandise, into property, demoted from persona, that's Latin, from res things to persona, in order to produce the cotton, the tobacco, and the sugar which was sold overseas. So that whatever lifestyles, whatever philosophical outlook the Africans had worked out for themselves during that evolutionary development, they had been forced to change all that during that voyage, which has come to be known as the Middle Passage. In the new world of the Caribbean slave society, where they had arrived, they were broken, battered, and molded until Europeans had made of them those specific beings which they required for the express demands of slavery on the plantation. So that African ontology, African metaphysics, which the people had, which were based on a very close relationship of one being with another, had to be altered drastically. That is what I take it to mean by Gilberto Freire saying that these people were no longer Africans, they were West Indians who were now slaves. Now, we must take a look at the Afro-West Indian's background because that is what is most important in understanding of him. The people who were brought here from Africa to the West Indies came from a variety of nations and with a diversity of social, economic, political, and cultural institutions. The Europeans like to call them, tribes, but they were really nations. One nation different to the other, as France is from Russia and so on. They also came from a number of kingdoms, many of which were very highly organized entities. In the Caribbean today, we have recognized many of the vital elements of Caribbean African culture, which existed in the islands during the period of slavery, and which have extended their influences into the present. And I have one of those books by Roger Bastide on that topic. In those African kingdoms, law and order reigned, and the people were under the direction of their kings and priests. With that went a discipline which was traditional in African culture. Discipline ruled from within as well as outside of the family. And that discipline was exacted from the earliest days in the life of the child. There's a very nice book by Camara Lafanois, The Dark Child. And from Martinique, we have another one, René Marin, entitled Batuala. And they tell us a lot about African village life. In fact, René Marin was the first black writer to write about African traditional village life from within. And his first novel, which was published in 1920, it won the Prix Goncourt, and that one is entitled Batuala. Later on, Marin wrote several novels. They lived in Abous and so on, but they all had animals as characters, impersonating human beings. They lived in Abous and so on. Now, although in those African societies there were many systems of religious beliefs, one element seems to have been common to them all, the belief in magic. Magic constituted only one aspect of those systems in which pantheons of deities, each pantheon and each member of each pantheon with a special function, which we recognize in certain areas of the Caribbean. In the ancestral cult, for example, with the spirits of the dead, envisaged as living on in another world, yet very much alert to manifest power for good and evil among the descendants. What we have in Haiti, for example, there's a special ceremony, Ceremony of the Souls, where at certain times during that ceremony, the people who are descendants of those who have departed, they now summon the spirits of those who have departed and ask them questions. Maybe a mother was not very fond of her husband and want to know why, or a father did not like his daughter, and so on and so forth, want to know that. Now, when we look at the political structure, we see that the monarch in Africa towered above the structure of African life, but there was also a very highly efficient administration organization. Above all, the basic attitude of Africa to life was a blend of cooperation and competition, and many of the societies had a pecuniary base with women dominating the economy. And when you go to Accra in Ghana, or in Nairobi, or even Nigeria, in the marketplace it's mostly women you see. And I have gone to the market in St. Lucia, and they sit the same way as I saw these women sitting in Africa selling their wares and so on. Very powerful. That then, in brief, constitute the cultural patterns from which most of the West Indians obtained the elements which have survived to this day. West Indian culture, therefore, when it finally emerged, was inevitably Africa-based. But I discussed that in another thing. The reason for that, when the Europeans came here, they never considered the West Indies, the islands, as their home. Home was somewhere else, Europe. So they never established anything. If you look around in the British Islands, all you see were prisons and forts. That's all the British left us here. And the mulattoes now, who were children, and I have a book on that. Was it? It's somewhere there. The mulattoes, who were children of the white men and the black slave women, they also did not consider the islands as their home. Home was somewhere else, the mother country. So that the Africans, the bulk of the people, the slaves, who had no contact with the Europeans, they held on to the African culture, the Africanness, so that when emancipation came, the only thing that belonged to the West Indies was the African culture, or the African-based culture. Cuba is very pleased about that, and they talk about it a lot, they write about it a lot. So there's Haiti. Now, we go now to the beginning of the slave trade. I am going now to look at the processes, the de-Africanization of the African, making him this West Indian. And I begin on the shores of Africa, and my chronicler is a Portuguese. His name was Inanez de Azuzara. He was a nobleman. And this is what he tells us. Very early in the morning, on account of the heat, the mariners began to assemble their lighters and to disembark their captives according to their orders, which captives were gathered together in a field, and marvelous it was to see among them some of a rosy whiteness. I stopped there right away. Rosy whiteness in Africa, they were capturing them. Some of a rosy whiteness, fair and well made, others less white, verging on gray, others again as black as moles, as various in their complexions as in their shapes. And what heart was so hard as not to be moved to pity by the sight of this multitude? Some with bowed heads and tearful countenances, others groaning dolorously and with eyes uplifted towards heaven, as if to implore help from the Father of all mankind. While there were others who covered their faces with their hands and flung themselves down upon the ground, and some again who gave vent to their sorrow in a dirge, after the manner of their country. And although we could not understand the words, well we appreciated the depths of their distress. And now, to aggravate their woe, men came to parcel them out into 5 distinct lots, to do which they tore the son from the father, the wife from the husband, the brother from his brethren. No tie of blood or comradeship was respected. Each was thrown into a place by chance. And now, this nobleman tells us what happens. He says the Africans who are being separated, they embrace one another so tightly that it needs no little strength to tear them apart. Such a division, indeed, was not to be effected without great trouble, since parents and children, finding themselves in different groups, would run back to their others. Mothers clutched up their little children and ran away with them, caring not about the blows they received, so long as their little ones should not be torn from them. So that is the beginning of the slave trade. And what do we notice here? This is the first attack on African culture. And what is it? The breakup of the family. First attack on African culture. Now, the first Englishman to venture in the slave trade was Sir John Hawkins. I have his work there somewhere. And this is what he tells us. He left England in the month of October 1562 and arrived in Sierra Leone. And he says, which place by the people of the country is called Tagarin, where he stayed some good time and got into his possession partly by the sword and partly by other means, to the number of 300 Negroes at the least, besides other merchandise which the country yielded. With his prey, he sailed over the ocean sea onto the island of Hispaniola and arrived at the first port of Isabella. The English in those days were very strict. Prey is spelled P-R-A-Y-E. Sailed is spelled S-A-Y-L-E-D. During the voyage to take the blacks across the Atlantic, many of them took the opportunity to leap overboard, only to become victims of the sharks. The sharks were always following the slave ships from the smell, and the bodies were thrown overboard. The journey might last from 6 weeks to 2 months, depending upon the weather. Now, for example, Sir John Hawkins experienced some difficulties, and he says us, for the space of 18 days we were becalmed, having now and then contrary winds and some tornadoes amongst the same calm, which happened to us very ill. being but reasonably watered, for so great a company of Negroes and ourselves, which pinched us all, and that which was worse, put us in such fear, F-E-A-R-E, that many never thought to have reached to the Indies without great death of Negroes and of themselves. But the Almighty God, who never suffers his elect to perish, sent us the 16th of February the ordinary breeze, which is the northwest wind, which never left us till we came to an island of cannibals called Dominica. Now, when the weather was hot, when it was bad, that is, during a gale or hurricane or so, the hatches were battened down to protect the cargo, and the blacks were denied their daily exercise. That bad weather might last, say, several days, and during that time, the blacks were kept down below in the stifling heat, eating, drinking, urinating, defecating, getting seasick, vomiting, dying, tempers fraying, quarreling, children being born, people dying, all that in that one spot where they were packed and chained, having to live and sleep in all that muck and filth and stench until the storm was over. After one such storm, a doctor had to go down below to see how much of the cargo was lost. And this is what the report is left us. Some hot and blowing weather, having occasioned the portholes to be shut and the grating to be covered, fluxes and fevers among the Negroes resulted. When they were in this situation, my profession requiring it, I frequently went down among them, till at length their apartments became so extremely hot as to be only sufferable for a very short time. But the excessive heat was not the only thing that rendered their situation intolerable. The deck, that is the floor of their rooms, was so covered with blood and mucus, which had proceeded from them in consequence of the flux, that it resembled a slaughterhouse. It is not in the power of the human imagination to picture a situation more dreadful and disgusting. Numbers of the slaves had fainted, they were carried on deck, where several of them died, and the rest were with difficulty restored. It nearly proved fatal to me also. What this white man is saying is no white man could survive down there in that condition, but we survived, and we are the descendants of those who survived. Now, whatever life the Africans may have lived before being taken away from Africa, from the accustomed communal societies in their respective nations, they went straight, as I said, into a modern industrial society, the sugar plantations of the West Indies. How they were received and treated, those blacks, who had survived the voyage and were landed in the West Indies. One account is by an Englishman who was in Barbados at the time. He's Richard Ligon, and he tells us that, that's his book over there, the green one, very expensive book, that. He tells us, when they are brought to us, the planters buy them out of the ship, where they find them stark naked, and therefore cannot be deceived in any outward infirmity. They choose them as they do horses in a market. The strongest, youthfulest, and most beautiful yield the greatest prizes. 30 pounds sterling is the price for a best man Negro, and 25, 26, or 27 pounds for a woman. The children are at easier rates, in other words, half price. Now, we go for another account now. And another person tells us, when the ship reached the harbor, the cargo came up on deck to be bought. Their purchasers examined them for defects, looked at the teeth, pinched the skin, tasted the perspiration to see if the slave's blood was pure and his health as good as his appearance. Some of the women affected a curiosity, the indulgence of which, with a horse, would have caused them to be kicked 20 yards across the deck. But the slave had to stand it. Then, in order to restore dignity, which might have been lost by too intimate an examination, the purchaser spat in the face of the slave. Having become the property of his owner, it was branded on both sides of the chest with a hot iron. His duties were explained by an interpreter, and the priest instructed him in the first principles of Christianity. Now, I must explain this thing about some of the women affected in curiosity. One afternoon, after a broadcast, George Lamming, Sam Selvin, I can't remember who else was there, maybe Salki and myself. We sat down in the canteen at the BBC, and Selvan was telling us a story about the same business still happening today. Selvan was working in a factory. At that time, they're struggling as writers, so they have to find a job. Selvan is working in this factory, and there were, I think, a Jamaican fellow there as well. And one afternoon, just as they're breaking off from work, some of the English girls grabbed this Jamaican fellow, dragged him into the toilet to see if what they said is very true about the black man. So that's what this fellow said, somewhat will affect the curiosity, the indulgence of which with the horse would have caused him to be kicked. Go ahead. Now, what many people have asked, how is it possible for a handful of whites in the West Indies to keep in subjection for so long such a number of slaves? There was the police force for the day-to-day administration of law and order. Then there was the militia to quell any serious uprising. Finally, there was the Royal Navy to protect the Europeans' kith and kin and to safeguard interests in the islands. Now, and Ligon tells us, and he was down there in 1640, Ligon, it has been accounted a strange thing that the Negroes, being more than double the number of Christians that they are, and they accounted a bloody people, where they think they have power or advantage, and the more bloody by how much they are more fearful than others, that these should not commit some horrid massacre upon the Christians, thereby to enfranchise themselves and to become masters of the island. But there are three reasons that take away this wonder. The one is they are not suffered to touch or handle any weapons. The other, that they are held in such awe and slavery as they are fearful to appear in any daring act. And seeing the mustering of our men, and hearing their gunshot, than which nothing is more terrible to them, their spirits are subjugated to so low a condition as they dare not look up to any bold attempt. Besides these, there is a third reason, and that's very important to us, which stops all designs of that kind, and that is they are fetched from several parts of Africa who speak several languages, and by that means one of them understands not the other. For some of them are fetched from Guinea and Benin, some from Kuchu and some from Angola and from the River Gambia. They never put two slaves on the same tribe to work together, so they cannot communicate. What do we learn from that? They had to learn a new language. Yes? So it's little bits of information like that from all these books you see here. A little bit here, a little bit there. I glean something, I put the thing together, understand what is happening in the Caribbean. Now, we come down to the meat of the matter. When slavery and slave trade began, the Europeans did not go to Africa, capture the blacks, ship them to the West Indies, place them on the plantation, and whip in hand, compel them to work. Apart from the violence and the brutality, there was a multitude of slave laws which were supposed to regulate every aspect of the slave trade. So we begin with the Spaniards. They were the first in the West Indies to introduce slavery. The Spanish treatment of the Amerindians was abominable, completely different from the treatment of Negro slaves who came later. Yet of all the nations practicing slavery in the West Indies, the Spanish slave laws were the most lenient. The Spaniards had enacted what they called the siete partidas, and those laws were based upon the principle that the slave was a person, persona, not res. And those laws were based upon the principle that the slave was a person, etc. That meant that the slave had to receive the legal protection. In the partidas, slavery was looked upon as a misfortune, from the consequences of which the slaves would be protected as far as possible, because the Spaniards held that the slaves were men, and because they were men, man is a noble animal. That meant not meant for servitude. The fact sprang from the laws of medieval Spain, where they had slavery before. And the law was humane. The Spaniards simply transferred or introduced this principle to the West Indies. The slave master was regarded, therefore, as having duties towards his slaves as well as rights over them. And the law says, a master has complete authority over his slave to dispose of them as he pleases. Nevertheless, he should not kill or wound them, although he may give cause for it, except by order of the judge of his district, nor should he strike him in any way contrary to natural reason or put him to death by starvation. The slave laws in the Spanish West Indies tended to favor the good treatment of the slaves and the manumitted slaves. The Siete Partidas laid down, among other things, that the slave in-law was entitled to the protection of or intervention of the legal authorities on his behalf, and the master could actually lose his property in the slave as a result of proved maltreatment of the slave. In certain cases of serious abuse of the slave's rights, for instance, the slave was compulsory manumitted. Such an abuse was the violation or prostitution of a field slave. At one time, there was serious conflict between the Spaniards in Puerto Rico and the other slave-owning European powers, because in Puerto Rico, they were always giving asylum to fugitive slaves from the non-Spanish territories. The Spaniards also introduced a system called the coartación, where a slave could buy his freedom from after the two, master and slave, had agreed upon a price. The law stated that at no time could the master raise the price once it had been fixed. Here again in the West Indies, as it seemed in other things which we shall discover later, many customs started in the West Indian islands which were later exported to the rest of the colonial world. A slave, for example, was able to buy his freedom on deferred terms, that is on the never-never, in installments. That is, a slave paid the master in installments. The law also stated that if the slave had paid the first installment and was then sold to another slave master, the slave was not required to pay more than the remainder of the original price to the new master. As a coartación, a Spanish slave had a legal right to change his master with or without cause. We see then how the relatively liberal spirit of the Spanish law influenced the form of society which sprang in the Spanish West Indies. Now we look at the British. We need to understand something about English law with regard to property. For the basic concept of the English law in relation to the slaves was that they were property, a special kind of property, that is, property in person. Slaves then, being merchandise when bought and sold in the ordinary course of the slave trade, once a planter had acquired a slave, that slave became the owner's property, private property, and as such, regarded in part as chattel, in part as real property. As chattel, a slave in English law could be sold for debts. In all other instances, the law of inheritance of real estate applied, and slaves could be sold or disposed of in that manner. For example, slaves could be entailed, they could be mortgaged, they were subject to the widow's right of dowry. That was the English law then, that is the English law today relating to private property. And in the days of slavery and the slave trade, the English law stated that trading in slaves was a recognized legal activity. The concept that slaves were property was firmly established in the laws of the British West Indian colonies. In fact, in a decree of 1677, it was held that Negroes being bought and sold among merchants, so merchandise also being infidels, there might be property in them. Now, there is something even more relevant in that respect. Certain people at the time who did not have England's interest at heart maybe, or they had no slaves, who had been in the habit of smuggling a slave or two into the country in order to testify to the condition of slavery in the West Indies, and thus lend weight to Wilberforce and them fellows, the abolition movement, they were soon put right by a distinguished author of English law, Sir William Blackstone. And Blackstone ruled that with regard to any right the master may have lawfully acquired to the perpetual service of John or Thomas, this will remain exactly in the same state of subjection for life, in England or elsewhere. So that, I'll talk to him. 6 years after, another judge, Blackstone, handed down a different ruling. After Blackstone. And that one was Justice Mansfield. He was the one who set the slave free. And the practice in England at the time, until 1776, when slavery was abolished in England, when a slave got too old, the master would throw him out in the street, man, go about your business, fend as you like. In fact, there were so many of them. There's I don't know which of you know London, but there's a spot between Leicester Square and Tottenham Court Road, the underground station, on the right-hand side, called St. Giles. There's a church, there's St. Giles Church. The Queen was there last year on this same thing. And They used to gather around this place. They got a lot of theaters around this place. And they used to call them the St. Giles Blackbirds. Well, this fellow, Somerset, was very ill, so the master threw him out. These fellows from the Clapham sect, they came upon this fellow in a street called Leadenhall Street. Leadenhall Street is part, the main street in the city of London. The city of London is a 4 square miles. It was built by the Romans, called Londinium in those days. And they came upon this fellow, Somerset, and saw that he had been restored to good health, so they claimed their property. So the fellows who had nursed him back to life said they're going to bring a test case before the courts. And that case went on for a long time. Everybody parted, some for, some against, and all that sort of thing. And the Lord Chief Justice Mansfield was in a quandary. And he discovered, wait a minute, English law does not permit slavery on English soil. So the slave had to be free. Somerset had to be free. No slaves at home on English soil, but you can carry on in West Indies. That was sick. Yeah? In fact, the slaves from after the abolition of slavery in England in 1776, a lot of them went back to Africa. They were helped, assisted in going back there, and they formed a country called Sierra Leone. And because they were freed, they named the capital Freetown. The same thing happened to the slaves in the United States. When they were freed, some of them went back to Africa, those wanted to go, and they formed a country called Liberia. President Monroe was the one at the time, president of the United States, so the slaves called the capital Monrovia. Right. Now, we go on, and later that same year, in 1783, a vessel called the Zong was on a voyage from West Africa to the West Indies with a shipment of slaves. They ran into difficulties because the weather would be calm and so on, and water and food was running short. The captain, in order to save the rest of the cargo, decided to throw overboard 132 Negroes. The owners of slaves brought an action for insurance. If you were shipping cargo, you insure your cargo. Well, you pay freight insurance and what have you. So they brought an action for cargo. The insurance company did not want to pay. Chief Justice Mansfield ruled that the case of slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard, and he awarded the owners damages of £30 against each slave. So the insurance company had to pay. Again in 1785, another insurance case came before Lord Chief Justice Mansfield. In this case, it was a Negro. The Negroes on the ship had mutinied, and several of them were killed. Lord Chief Justice Mansfield again ruled that the slaves who had died in the mutiny would be paid for by the insurance people. So that the principle that slaves were property had been firmly established in English law. In the British West Indies, laws were enacted so that the police would keep the slaves in their fixed status as the legal property of their owners. The law allowed the slave owner virtually unlimited power over his property. To maintain that law, it was necessary to bring in police regulations to uphold the convention that the slave was private property. And in England, you don't interfere with a man's private property. You can kill, you can murder, they put you for life, but if you raid money, they find somehow, wherever you are, they'll find you years later and you're convicted. The police were white. Those police regulations worked in all cases against the slaves because the blacks had been reduced to mere property. To have it otherwise would have meant that the recognition of slaves as persons, and that was not allowed. Police law, therefore, regarding the enforcement of the abolition of slaves was a paramount concern to the planters. Because a slave was property, a person who stole a slave was apprehended by the police and brought before the court, and he was convicted of felony. The law compensated the owner of a slave who had suffered the judicial penalty of death. A slave did something, he was killed, the owner was awarded. To carry off a slave from the islands and without the owner's consent was punishable by death. People who aided runaway slaves were arrested by the police and punished by the courts. Slaves were not allowed to wander abroad without the written consent of the police or of the owner. Here we have the introduction of the pass laws, which were later taken to South Africa on the apartheid regime. Slaves were not allowed to handle firearms, to beat drums, to blow horns, to assemble together in numbers. Police regulations covered the maintenance of all these things. Even the economic activities of the slaves were under police supervision. Slaves were often allotted plots of land to grow food for their own upkeep. In many instances, the industrial slaves would grow more than is required, sold the rest on the Sunday market, you know, the famous song, Linseed Market, which was allowed by the police regulations. With that money, over a number of years, a slave was able to buy his freedom. The economic activities of the Negroes and of the mulattoes were also subject to police regulations. Now, one law says that only whites in the British West Indies enjoyed the privilege of trial by jury. In 1688, the white planters who framed the laws stated that blacks, being British slaves, deserve not, from the basis of their condition, to be tried by the legal trial of 12 men of their peers or neighborhood, which truly neither can rightly be done as the subjects of England are. To the whites in the West Indies, therefore, humane treatment of slaves was of secondary importance. Self-preservation was a primary concern. The laws, therefore, were meant to be excessively repressive, and that was how they remained until the end of the 18th century, when the planters were forced to make some amends in the condition of the slaves. Brian Edwards, who owned a lot of slaves in St. Vincent, he was a slave owner, plantation owner. He was also a historian. He says, in 1801, he wrote, in countries where slavery is established, the leading principle on which the government is supported is fear, or a sense of that absolute coercive necessity which, leaving no choice of action, supersedes all questions of right. Now, let us look at the French, how they treated their slaves. In the beginning, the French approach, the whole question was very, very sophisticated, very different. In 1685, the Metropolitan Government of France drew up what they call a slave code. They call it the Code Noir. That code, although it was drawn up in France, was not intended to be a code of laws. The Code Noir was drawn with the West Indies specifically in mind, and solely for dealing with slaves. The difference between them and the British is one of tremendous importance. In France, the monarchy had great powers both at home and abroad. The Crown, therefore, returned powers of legislation in the West Indies. Britain had it differently. The power of legislation was vested not by the Crown, but by the island legislature, that is Legislative Council, which we had in St. Lucia. Britain could always claim, therefore, in matters relating to the ill treatment of slaves, that was an internal matter. Britain was always doing that, in fact. They did that in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. You know what happened in Zimbabwe when the people declared, the white people in Zimbabwe, that's Mugabe's country, decided to declare UDI, Universal Declaration of Independence. Now, unlike the British colonies, the French Code Noir insisted on religious conformity. In France, French law required the same for Frenchmen. The Code Noir also regulated the status and conduct of slaves and was concerned with public security and the protection of slaves as property as well as person. Now, I say here it is important to remember those differences. For while we are looking at the West Indies, we must not imagine that the various islands developed in the same manner. They had the common experience of slavery, which is true, but the black man in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Barbados, Antigua, St. Lucia, or Trinidad evolved socially and culturally different because of the different legal, political, economic, and social attitudes of the people who governed them. Now, there were also laws for the protection of slaves and laws encouraging their conversion to Christianity. There were also laws for hanging and trying and for the punishing of masters for the cruelty of the slaves. There's one thing I must jump to when I look at the slave noir. The Code Noir also insisted the slaves were to be baptized in the Catholic faith. Also, that overseers and planters on the plantations must be Catholics. When the British or Dutch island was captured by the French, the law was not applied, and so on. Slaves in the French islands were always to observe Sundays and religious holidays, were to be married if baptized, and were to be buried in consecrated ground. The British don't do that. Slaves in the British West Indies were not permitted to marry, and the early missionaries had more than their fair share of difficulties in trying to give the slaves some religious instructions. In the end, they were forced to side with the planters and become the instruments of the state. In the British West Indies also, slaves, mulattoes, and whites were buried in separate cemeteries. The blacks in St. Lucia were buried at Jacques. The whites were buried at that old cemetery up the road there, for a show. And I think the mulattoes were with the nuns at the top there, the top of the Darling, the right-hand side. The Darling? Yeah, Calvary. Yeah. Oh dear. Anyway, these are the differences that we have to zones from. Now, in 1686, I'm taking the things because I want to finish quickly. In 1686, one of the most touchy of questions in the British West Indies, that of the admissibility of slave evidence in court and in police proceedings, was dealt with firmly in the Code Noir. The Code Noir made that evidence admissible, so a slave could testify against his owner for ill treatment. The slave could now make complaints against his master in cases where the master failed in his duties to the slave. For example, in his matter of subsistence, they never wanted to feed the slaves. They were always looking for excuses to welcome. In fact, that is why Captain Lai was sent to Tahiti to collect the breadfruit, take the West Indies, to feed the slaves. One breadfruit could feed about 4 people. And it was in his second voyage that the mutiny on the Bounty took place. The first breadfruit tree is planted in St. Vincent, in the Botanical Garden, is still there. Now, let us look at the British West Indies. That was the case in West Indies. If the English father so wished, as regard to children, then he freed the child. If the children was by an overseer, who was often either English, Scots, or Irish indentured laborer, then the overseer had to purchase that child's freedom from the slave owner or plantation owner. That is, if the father cared sufficiently for his child. The practice, more often than not, was to sell the child of mixed blood, the mulatto, at a higher price because of his lighter complexion. And here I say, we introduce into the Caribbean this business of color consciousness, shades in the Caribbean. The French did something, and I think the British too, they did something even more abhorrent. The mulatto slave women, they sold to the brothels in New Orleans, fetch a lot of money. Right. In one respect, though, French law was less acceptable than that of the British. An English judge had ruled that English law did not permit slavery on English soil, so that from that time onwards, once a slave had set foot in England, he was free, except, of course, if that slave was stupid enough to go back to his country. And that was happened to a slave called Grace. She came to England, she was freed, and because she was free, she thought she could go back to Antigua. No good. When she got back there, the master claimed her, she was back into slavery. Now, in France, that was not the case. If the black were not a freed person, a black or mulatto, then he remained as a slave and private property. Moreau de Saint-Méry, in his study of the French law, says that that had not always been the practice, but that the Crown had altered the section of the Code Noir in order to protect the French West Indian property. Now, we have, when Napoleon, the French always had blacks in, even during slavery, the blacks and mulattoes in politics in France and in Haiti. When Napoleon came to power, things really began to change. Napoleon was outright racialist, although he had married a mulatto woman, Josephine. St. Lucia says she was born here, Martinique says she was born over there. Now, Josephine was formerly the Countess Beauharnais because she was married to an aristocrat, very wealthy person. Napoleon's attitude towards the people of color was ambiguous. He supported slavery, and he wished it restored when the blacks in San Domingo rebelled. Yet he had freed blacks and mulattoes in his army. Some of them, like Alexandre Dumas, the father, so he was also a novelist. Alexandre Dumas held high office. Some of Dumas' admirers have argued that the only reason Napoleon did not give him in the Field Marshal's baton because Dumas was a general, but Napoleon did not elevate him to give him the Field Marshal baton because of his color. Dumas remained a general. There were freed blacks and freed mulattoes as well in the National Assembly in Paris long before and even Napoleon's time. Napoleon was ambitious. He needed money and he sought status. That is why he got married to Josephine. Now, A declaration from the Crown says, while the slaves should be maintained and favorably treated by their masters, the necessary precautions should also be taken to maintain them within the bounds of their duty and to prevent all that might be feared from them. Later we hear the Crown saying, it is only by leaving to the masters a power that is nearly absolute that it will be possible to keep so large a number of men in their state of submission, which is made necessary by their numerical superiority, and so on. So we have then police regulations conditioning the entire slave society. Barbados, and I said there are some novels in England. I have one or two here. One is this one here, Thackeray's Vanity Fair. There were innumerable slave uprisings down the length and breadth of the Caribbean island. The first slave uprising occurred in Barbados in the 17th century, in 1640. But the most famous was the one from San Domingo. Barbados was the only island not stumbled upon by Christopher Columbus. It does not lie in the path of the trade winds, so Columbus missed it. A man named John Powell, on a voyage from Brazil to England with a shipment of tobacco, came upon the island. He returned a year later with 1,200 adventurers, Scots and English, and took possession of the island. What was even more ideal for them was that the island was uninhabited, the only island in the Caribbean that was uninhabited, Barbados. The new arrivals on the island, they settled there and lived well in relative comfort until they decided to introduce Negro slavery, for they had seen that the other islands were doing very well with slavery, in particular Brazil. They introduced a large number of indentured laborers, Irish, Scots, and English. 10 years later, after they had introduced first slaves, we get the first slave uprising. And Richard Lygon tells us how it happened. He said, a little before I came thence, there was such a combination amongst them as the like was never seen before. Their sufferings being grown to a great height, and their daily complainings to one another of the intolerable burdens they labored under, being spread throughout the island, at the last some amongst them, whose spirits were not able to endure slavery, resolved to break through it or die in the act. And so conspired with some others of their acquaintance, whose sufferings were equal, if not above theirs, and their spirits no way inferior, resolved to draw as many of the discontented party into the plot as possible they could. And those of their persuasion were the greatest number of servants on the island, so that a day was appointed to fall upon their masters and cut their throats, and by that means to make themselves not only freedmen, but masters of the island. That was happening in Barbados in 1640. That is what happened in Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil, Guyana, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, Jamaica. The pattern was the same. That was happened in Cuba in 1958. That was the beginning of West Indian history. The West Indians, black slaves as well as indentured laborers, wanted not only their freedom, but they wished to remove their masters and to make themselves masters of the island in St. Dominic. Now, the goods they produced in these islands were not for their benefit, but for the consumption overseas. The West Indian blacks could never get themselves used for that kind of slavery. That is why throughout the history of the West Indies, we find that dominant desire, always expressed, but however expressed, but always there, that desire for liberty, the ridding themselves of that particular burden which is special inheritance of the black skin. That is why also that the West Indians have been the most rebellious people in the entire history of the world. They cannot stomach injustice. They will fight it whenever and wherever it comes up. The West Indians could not understand, and we will never be able to understand them if we do not know what happened there. It must be understood also that because they were black people, they were made slaves, and the white people of the West Indies were never slaves in the ordinary sense of the word. That is West Indian history. And that part is also West Indian history, why that rebellion failed. Lygon tells us why. He says, and so closely was the plot carried, as no discovery was made till the day before they were put in act. And then one of them, either by the failing of his courage or some new obligation of the love of his master, revealed this long-plotted conspiracy. And so by this timely advertisement, the masters were saved. Justice Heathersall, whose servant this was, sending letters to all his friends, and they to theirs, and so to one another, till they were secured. and by examination found out the greatest part of them, whereof 18 of the principal men in the conspiracy, and they were the first leaders and contrivers of the plot, were put to death for example to the rest. And the reason why they made example of so many was they found these so haughty in their resolutions and so incorrigible as they were like enough to become actors in a second plot. And so they thought good to secure them and the rest to have a special eye over them. This must not be passed over too lightly. The observation that is made there about the slaves' incorrigibility. Now we had another man, Pierre Labat. He was on his way to visit the churches, plantations, and slaves in Grenada. He heard that the people who were in charge, they were doing some bobble and so on, so they sent him down to investigate. So Labat decided to visit all the islands in the Caribbean. St. Lucia, Dominica, Barbados, all of them. And this is what he tells us when he got to Barbados. He was there in 1700. And he says about the engagés. These engagés are indeed numerous, but should not be trusted, as they are poor Irishmen for the most part, who grown in a very harsh servitude lasted for 7 or at least 5 years. These unfortunates are, as often as not, compelled to commence a fresh period of servitude, and no matter what protests or reasons the masters allege in order to prolong their bondages, the judges never question them. Indeed, if this island were attacked, the masters would have their hands full, for these men would certainly turn their weapons against them and join the invaders, if only to recover their freedom. The last sentence, I do not mention what they would have to fear from the Negroes. If the white slaves can do that, you can imagine the blacks. The blacks in the island at the time were not more than 60,000, and so on. He then goes on to tell us how they treated the slaves. But a part that I will read for you is, let me see. Oh, yes. Just one paragraph. The English do not look after their slaves well and feed them badly. And as a rule, the slaves are free to work on Saturdays to provide themselves all their own and their family requirements. The overseers get every ounce of work out of them, beat them without mercy for the least fault, and appear to care far less for the life of a Negro than for a horse. It is true that they obtain their slaves very cheaply. For besides the English companies in Africa that bring over an enormous quantity of slaves to America, the interlopers bring still more slaves and sell them cheaper than the companies. The clergymen do not instruct the slaves or baptize them, and the Negroes are regarded more like the beasts to whom all license is permitted, so long as they do their work properly. And listen to this. They are allowed to have several wives and to desert them as they please. And provided that they have plenty of children, work hard, and do not get ill, their masters are quite satisfied and ask no more of them. In England, I attended so many conferences and what have you, lectures, and one of the complaints or the criticism of the West Indians too was like a refrain every conference I attend. They said that we are promiscuous and we like to brutalize our children. And here this man tell you they're allowed to have several wives, desert them as they please, and provided that they have plenty of children, work hard and do not get ill, the masters are quite satisfied and care no more of them. In fact, there is I forgot to bring it. There is a man, he was a planter and slave owner, a very large planter slave owner, called Matthew Lewis. He wrote a novel called The Monk. So you'll see they wrote Matthew Monk in inverted commas Lewis. Well, he was an absentee landlord. And once in a blue moon, he would go down to his plantation in Jamaica, and he will reward the women who had the most slaves, who had the most children during his absence. So the more children they have, and they call us, they say we are promiscuous. There. Now, a lot of executions took place in Barbados. And it says, these bloody executions do not happen so often among the French, because our slaves are not so numerous. Our religion makes them more humane, and they are treated more gently, that's French. But it was not so long ago that terrible execution took place in Martinique on account of a slave revolt that was almost general and occurred practically without warning. It is indeed true, this is a priest's opinion, it is indeed true that the desire for freedom and revenge is common to all humanity, and to obtain it, a man will commit any crimes. At least he gives it that. If you ever go to Martinique, you will see where he, in the north of Martinique, where he had his room on one of the estates there, the desk and his chair, where he wrote some of his memoirs, Pierre Labat. I think it was 8 volumes of that. Right. Now, let us go something else so we can end. Right. So by what I have said so far, we learned something about the society that was being established in the French, British, and Spanish colonies. In order to justify what they were doing to Africans, the Europeans invented the theory of race for the first time in the history of the world. So the black people became devils and imbeciles to be consumed that looked like tobacco, cotton, sugar, and molasses were consumed, so that white people in Europe would be made whiter, purer, nobler, and they hoped happier. Let us learn something about the society now, which that philosophy in the West Indies. How did it function? Politically, and we have that today, first of all, from the very beginning, West Indian society was based on violence and was maintained by violence. And when the time came to overthrow it, it had to use violence. It was also a society based on color and legal status. In fact, the French had 16 different shades: white, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, 16, and each, your shade of color or your complexion, your legal status was according to your complexion, etc. Politically, each island was administered independently of the other islands, etc., etc. And that is how the people wanted it. Political individualism marked the conduct of the islands in relation to each other, as we see today. We can't have form of federation and so on. The whites held power, black slaves and mulattoes were merely property, and so on. The economic, again, it was the white people who dominated the economy. Now, when they decided to abolish the slave trade, which is on the 23rd of this month, 1807, they decided to establish what they call the slave stud farm in Worthy Park, Jamaica, Barbados, and the most famous one is Barbuda, Arab, the slave stud farm. That meant that a woman need not know the man who fathered her children. And the children may never know who is their father. The child in slave law took the status of his mother and belonged to the master of the plantation. Inevitably, after 300 years of such a system, a way of life became established, which has remained in the West Indies to this day. Slavery, as we can see, was responsible for what has now become a marked feature of West Indian family life, family instability. Now, how this stud farm, although those were organized stud farms, but suppose very often this happened. I am a slave owner, plantation owner, let's say in the Mabuya Valley, and you know who was down there? In the Mabuya Valley, right? I won't mention names. I have a plantation in Mabuya Valley and my slaves, and I will go and visit my friend in Cul-de-sac. And I'll see, oh, I see he has a big strapping Negro there, man. And I said to him, look, lend me this fella for the night. I took him down to my plantation in Mabuya, and I forced him to mate with my women slaves. They had no choice. No choice. So, the woman doesn't know the man. The children, when they're born, don't know who the father is. Yes? Worse yet, the children did not belong to the mother. You see what has happened in St. Louis? We have the same thing, you know. In fact, there's one person who brought me a thesis for his doctorate recently, and it was on family life in St. Lucia. And I discovered that we have three different forms of family life in St. Lucia. You have the legal marriage, where the man and the woman are married legally. You have the one which the white men established in the Caribbean, concubinage, that is the man and the woman living together but they're not married. And then you have the other one now, the other kind. The woman lives in Crozile, the man lives in Lac Leary, and once a week or so he goes up there and sleeps with her, goes back home. 3 types of family life we have in St. Lucia. In the Caribbean, for that matter, not only. And the poorest white person could own a slave in the Caribbean, although they could not afford a plantation. What some of them did was to buy a slave or 2, whatever they could afford, and then hire that slave out to the plantations and sit back and enjoy the profits. One source of information tells that the planters paid about 6 to 9 pence a day, plus food for a hired slave. A valet could be hired for 18 shillings a month. Cooks, nursemaids, and seamstresses and grooms were available for 8 and 20 pounds per annum, and so on. Now, the established churches, that is the Catholic, Anglican, and Methodist, they accepted slavery. They shared the outlook of the white ruling class, with which they were closely identified by bonds of affinity. The clergy, therefore, closed their eyes to any deviation of the whites from the moral code laid down in their religion. They accepted slavery, and they regarded it as political rather than a moral institution. And they based their work in the Caribbean on acceptance or with legality. The directives from Europe to the churches laid down quite clearly the function of the church was to teach submission to the slaves and obedience to their masters. They also saw to it that the slaves broke off all cultural ties with Africa. All cultural ties, that is what were not sanctioned by the church. And they tried their utmost to inculcate in the slaves a sense of moral obligation which would bind them to their masters, etc. Today in the West Indies, where black people have accepted Christianity, is not because of, but in spite of, the clergy and their racist attitude. In Africa, the Africans had already arrived at the conception of a supreme deity, a supreme being who ruled by the fiat of his all-conquering will. When, therefore, they heard the clergy talk about such things as omnipotent, they were already familiar with them. Where they did not reject their own African religion, as in Cuba, Haiti, Trinidad, and Brazil, the African adopted their Christian deity. And we have a book by an African Mongo Betty, Le Pauvre Christ de Bomba, The Poor Christ of Bomba, is written in Cameroons. They speak German, French, and English. And this fellow, Mongo Betty, wrote this book, Le Pauvre Christ de Bomba. And when the missionaries came and established the churches, the Africans said, hey, you can have that piece of land, build your church there, and so on. And they all flocked to the church. And then they stopped. So the missionaries asked one of the catechism, why have these people stopped coming? They were coming in such large numbers. Where are they? He said, you see what happened? When you came here, they thought they would learn your secret of communication, telephone, aeroplanes, and this, that, and the other. And he said, all you were talking is about God and the soul. He said, we had that before you all came. Right. End of story. Right. The freed people of color, as the mulattoes, did not enjoy any legal status in the British West Indies. The mulattoes came to occupy a marginal position between the whites and the blacks. In 1802, in Grenada, the mulattoes had to lead the revolt before the whites in the West Indies and the British Parliament would allow them the very minimum of legal protection. The proliferation of criminals, prostitutes, and other destitute whites who were dumped in the West Indies every year enjoyed more freedom than the mulattoes. About the poor whites, one observer of the period noted that the slave system provided them with the first means of improving their economic position. That same writer later remarked that the whites were very unpolished beings who, when Europe first sent them out to us, Brian Edwards now, in 1708, he tells us that the poorest white person seems to consider himself nearly on a level with the richest, and emboldened by this idea, approaches employer with extended hand of freedom, which, in the countries of Europe, is seldom displayed by many in the lower orders of life towards their superiors. It is not difficult to trace the origin of this principle. It arises, without doubt, from the preeminence and distinction which are necessarily attached to the complexion of a white man in a country where the complexion, generally speaking, distinguishes freedom from slavery. Again, we're talking about the racial prejudice of the whites. And in 1820, another writer on the West Indies, John Weller, he writes, "No property, however considerable, can ever raise a man or woman of color, even when combined with education, to the proper rank of a human being in the estimation of an English or Dutch Creole. They are always kept at a respectable distance." That sentiment was expressed by Captain Osborne in that as well, where this woman, very wealthy, mulatto one, comes to England, education, she's very wealthy and so on, and Captain Osborne's father, they're very destitute, and he wants his son to marry this woman, and the money. And the son says to the father, "Marry that mulatto woman? I don't like the color, sir. I'm not going to marry a Hottentot Venus." There is a book of essays that I have here, Charles Lamb. The essay is entitled "Imperfect Sympathies." He talks about the Negroes in England. "In the Negro countenance, you will often meet with strong traits of benignity. I have often felt yearnings of tenderness towards some of these faces, or rather masks, that have looked out kindly upon one in casual encounters in the streets and highways. I love what Fuller beautifully describes these images of God cut in ebony. But I should not like to associate with them, to share my meals and my good nights with them, because they are black." Okay? That's the attitude of the white people in England. Now we know why the West Indians have become such thing. Yeah. Now, the Brian Edwards again, he says that no white man of decent appearance will condescend to give his hand in marriage to a mulatto. The very idea is shocking. You marry a black woman, what? No. Yet there were numerous accounts by travelers in those days of slavery in the West Indies, 15th, 16th, 18th century. The reports of colonial officials complaints by the clergy or ordinary lay people, all attesting to that special attraction which the black woman seemed to excite in the white man. One traveler, Jean-Dick de la Barbinée, wrote a 3-volume book entitled Nouveau Voyage autour du Monde, which was published in Paris in 1728, in which he made his own observations regarding this preference of the whites for the black woman. Even, he said, when there are white women available. And he says, "I have often asked them for the reason for such an extraordinary taste, but they never could tell me. For my part, I believe that being suckled and reared by slave girls, they derive this inclination from their milk." You know what that means? The white woman in the West Indies, when she gave birth to a child, didn't breastfeed the child. He gave that child to a slave woman. And this character says, that is where the fellas got the love for the black flesh. Oh, yeah. But the white man did not marry the black woman. They instituted, it said, a system of concubinage, which the West Indians have always inherited. White men and black women with mulatto mistresses. In fact, the Comte de Boulay, we have the de Boulay still here. One of them was a governor. He had his black mistress as well. And when the time came, he was called back to France. He wrote this beautiful song, which is Martinique, Dominica, St. Lucia, almost regarded as a national anthem, Adieu Foulard. You all know that song? Adieu Foulard, Adieu madras, adieu gwendo à l'école Yeshua. Doudou à moi, li kapati, hélas, hélas, c'est pour toujours. Doudou à moi, li kapati, hélas, hélas, c'est pour toujours. Bâtiment la guerre, and all that sort of thing. We sing that all the time. You know, he just was so fond of his black woman, his black mistresses, and he was married. You know, this was the boule from yesterday. Anyway, dear. Now, I think we have done enough for the evening to give you some idea of what we're talking about. The rest of the book, I deal with well, I have seven chapters there. The title is West Indians, Portable People. And chapter 1 is, you have the introduction, then chapter 1, the creation of Caribbean society, which we are discussing tonight. Chapter 2, the old system crumbles, the significance of the slave revolt is in Dominic and the War of Independence. Chapter 3, the literature of revolt, the rejection of Europe. That is something at some future time I will come here and discuss with you all. Chapter 4, the flashing sign, the men of action, people like C.L.R. James, René Marat, Frantz Fanon, all these black men, West Indians, who gone to Africa fighting for Africa's independence. You know why Africa is independent today? It's free. West Indians, you know. George Padmore, C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, Félix Iboué, he was from Martinique, René Marat from Martinique, Frantz Fanon from Martinique. Fanon's book is like a Bible. In the days of the 1960s, in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, University of West Indies, in all the universities in Europe, Western Europe, in America, in England, Fanon's book was the Bible, Les Damnés de la Terre, Wretched of the Earth. He also wrote his first book, and I discovered how that book was written. I went to visit one of my friends in Switzerland, and I was walking down what's the capital again? Geneva. I was walking down the hill to the old city of Geneva, and I came upon this second-hand bookshop. And I saw this book. Well, I saw two books there that I wanted. One was a volume of essays by James Baldwin, Notes of a Native Son, and a small novel written by a Martinican woman, Je suis Martiniquaise. And she had all this love for this white man. She can't see a good thing in a black man. White. So Fanon read this, and he wrote a beautiful book, Peau Noire, Masque Blanc, black skin, white mask. You can get that. I have them at home. You can read in French or English. You can get the translation. The literature of revolt. Caliban demands a hearing, a question of identity. This is very important. Where I looked at the question of identity in Caribbean literature. And then number 6, the descent of black Orpheus, the poets, what they were doing. And one of the most marvelous things about the West Indies, no black poet in the West Indies has ever written anything derogatory about the black woman. Nothing, never. And he says all the beautiful things about the black woman, you know, and so on. There's one fellow from French Guiana, Leon Damas, he's dead now. Give me back my black dolls, so that I may play again them with naive gaze of my instinct, see in the shadow of its laws, recover my courage, my daring, feel myself again, my new self, which I was yesterday without, and so on and so forth. And he spent some time in Europe, in France. When he says about the white woman, he refers to the white women in Paris as those pale vendors of love who come and go along the boulevards of my boredom. But one of the things I found very interesting is the reason these poets have given for the survival of the black people in the West Indies. As I said at the beginning, the Caribs, the Arawaks, the Siboneyes, the Red Indians, the other people in Mexico and Peru and all these people, all disappeared. The black one is the only race that survived in the West Indies. And we have to hand it to the black woman who suffered all the indignities in order to survive in this thing. And here, to give you an idea of what they used to do, these white men, to the... I don't know if you all ever heard of this fellow, Iquiano. Very interesting fellow. He was a slave, but his masters took him to England. He was educated. So the next time he wrote this lovely book, Iquiano. He was in Montserrat. And he says what happened in Montserrat. And there's almost a constant practice with our clerks and other whites to commit violent depredations on the chastity of the female slaves. And there I was, though with reluctance, obliged to submit to all, being unable to help them. He was supposed to stand up there while the white men were. I have even known them gratify their brutal passion with females not 10 years old. And these abominations, some of them practiced to such scandalous excess. 9 and 10-year-old black girls, these white men were raping left, right, and center. And Iquiano has to stand up there and watch this thing, and he can't do anything about it. So that is why I said, when the West Indian poet, the black West Indian poet, came to write of the black woman, he could not find anything wrong. As one poet says, I will sing of you, little black girl, it is your hour now. Yeah? But very interesting, from a poet in Guadeloupe who's dead now, B.T. Rollier, he gives us the reason for the blacks having survived in the Caribbean. The poem is entitled Afrique, and it begins, te souviens réfléchis Afrique, de la chair labouée de mon peuple, car tu j'aime à moi depuis la nuit des temps. Your shoots flower again, Africa, in the rip pleasure of my people, for your seed has lain in me since the night of all time. And later on, in the poem, he says about the same survival, Voici vive our chair l'arbre mutilé, j'ai repoussé plus doux sous les sols étrangers, car ma race est vivace et beaucoup plus tenace que l'acacia coriace qui pousse à Saint-Dominique. Your shoots flower again, Africa, in the rip pleasure of my people. For your seed, yes, your shoots flower again, Africa, in the rip pleasure of my people. For your seed has lain in me since the night of all time. So you will find when you come to study West Indian literature, West Indian poetry, from the 19th century onwards, you will find that this rejection of Europe and so on. In fact, there was one poet, the same chap, T.O. from Guadeloupe. You see what's happening in Afghanistan and Iraq? That was happening in Guadeloupe some years ago, you know. Bombs going off, people shooting, because Guadeloupe was the only island that wanted independence from France. They rejected this assimilation thing. So we have this poem by Guy Thiolier, which is entitled Prière d'un petit enfant né, Prayer of a Little Negro Boy. And in the poem, he talks about how he has to get up in the morning and so on, so all this way, and going to school. He don't want to go to his white school. He keeps saying, please, I don't want to go to that school. And he says, je préfère vers les où la lune amoureuse parle par l'oreille des cocotiers penchés. Écoutez ce qu'il dit de la nuit, la voix cassée d'un vieux qui raconte l'histoire des embats et des copains lapins. Et bien d'autres choses, ils ne sont pas dans les livres. We don't see these things in these in the white books. What the education these white people tell us, I don't hear about copain lapin, copain tig. So they want us to walk like white men. He said, I don't want to go to that school. I don't want to go to school. I prefer to sit and listen to the old man sit on the coconut tree, man. Beautiful line, eh? Je préfère ver la lune amoureuse parle bas à l'oreille des cocotiers penchés. And there's another poem where Seiko, good friend of Léon Lamas, and Aimé Césaire, the only one alive is Aimé Césaire. And Lamas The poem is entitled Femme Noire. Femme nue, femme noire. Vêtue de la couleur qui évite la forme qui est beauté, and so on. And then he talks about the black woman, and you get that very often in West Indian poetry. The woman, both the mulatto and the black, referred to as a fruit, but a fruit that has to be eaten. Where Saint God says, Fruits mis à la chair ferme, sombres extases trouvés noirs, bouche qui fait lyrique ma bouche, firm flesh, ripe fruit, somber excesses of black wine, mouth which makes lyrical my mouth. And then later on in the poem, he refers to this black woman. Imagine the black woman with a ring of pearls around her neck, you know, and he says, Les perles sont étoiles sur la nuit de ta peau. Pearls are stars on the night of your skin, right? Now, I had to laugh because Senghor has written the most beautiful poems about the black woman. But he didn't marry a white woman. He married a white woman. So I said to myself, where did you get that experience? What do you know about that? Fouille bien la chair ferme, sauf ça tout bien noir. Bouche qui fait lyrique ma bouche. What do you know about that? But he was a fantastic poet. And I like him. I read him all the time. In fact, when the last piece I will read to you. When I got to Paris, and those black students were very militant and writing poetry and so on and so forth, these black poets brought out their first collection of poetry. They gave the volume to Jean-Paul Sartre, who was one of France's principal philosophers. He's also a philosopher. He also wrote some plays, a fantastic literary critic. But his philosophy was existentialism, which I won't go into now, too difficult. And they gave Jean-Paul Sartre to write the introduction to that volume of poetry. That introduction was so long, and it was so beautiful, that it is now published on its own. And the title is Orphée Noire, Black Orpheus. And this is how Sartre, looking at what the poets were saying, even though they were saying nasty things about Europe, this is how Sartre begins his introduction. Just what were you hoping when you removed the gags from all these black mouths? That they were going to sing your praises? And when the heads that our fathers brought down to earth rose up, did you expect to read adoration in their eyes? Here are men standing, looking at us, and I wish that you might feel as I do the thrill of being seen. For 3,000 years the white man had enjoyed the privilege of looking without being seen. He did nothing but look. The light of his eyes drew forth all things from their native shadow. The whiteness of his skin, condensed light, was another way of looking. The white man, white because he was a man, white as day, white as truth, white as virtue, lit up all creation like a torch, revealing the essence, secret and white, of his creatures. Today, these black men are returning our looks, staring down at us. They are in their turn black torches lighting the world, and our white heads are like Chinese lanterns buffeted by the wind. What did you expect from these blacks? After you've done so much to them, all these things. And I have not told you all the nasty things they did to us, but we survived. And although the poet Thiolien has given a reason for our survival, I sometimes explain it to some of my friends when I was in Europe. I said, you take a cat, you put him in a tall metal barrel. That cat can't jump out. You starve him for a whole week, and then you put a rat or a mouse, you put a mouse in there. What do you think will happen to that mouse? But that mouse escapes. He has found a strategy to escape. That's us. That mouse has a story to tell the world. We black people have a story to tell the world, how we survived. Again, I say, thanks to the women. And I heard people talking about that last night. What's the name? what's her name, the lady again? The lady from the archives, Thomas, and the other troublesome one. She's no Assos. What's her name again? This fattest woman. I heard our discussion last night with Gaspar Charlemagne. And they didn't know what they're talking about. These are things they should be telling the people how we survived, why the women were responsible for survival in the Caribbean, the things that women had to undergo in the West Indies to survive, to make that race survive. I have great respect for the black woman, great respect.